There is a five-word sentence that has been bouncing around the corridors of Windsor Castle, spilling into the ears of palace insiders, leaking out to the press, and landing on the breakfast tables of an entire nation. And once you hear what those five words were, who said them, and exactly who they were said to, you are going to understand why the power structure inside the British royal family has quietly and permanently changed. But before we get there, I need to walk you through everything that built toward that moment. Because those five words did not come from nowhere. They came from 50 years of silence, from a woman who has perfected the art of saying absolutely nothing in public while carrying everything in private. And they landed on the one person who least deserved to walk away from them feeling comfortable. This is a story about a debt, one that was owed for 25 years and that got paid in full last week. Not with a press release, not with a scandal. Not with a leaked statement or a tabloid headline carefully placed by a royal communications team. It got paid with a painting, a phone call, a quiet evening in an empty gallery, and five words said directly to someone's face with nobody else in the room. And I want to make sure you're still here when we get to those five words, because everything you're about to hear is the explanation for them. Every detail matters. So let's start where this story actually begins. Not in a gallery, and not last week. It begins in a storage room. The portrait that disappeared. Somewhere inside Windsor Castle, for over 2 decades, a portrait sat in the dark. It wasn't a portrait of a minor figure. It wasn't something tucked away because nobody cared about it, or because it had no artistic value. It was a portrait of Princess Diana, painted at what biographers consistently describe as the height of her public life. And it had been earmarked for one of the most important walls inside the entire royal residence. That wall is the Hall of Matriarchs. If you haven't encountered that name before, here's what you need to know about it. It is the ceremonial wall inside Windsor, reserved specifically for the women who helped build and define the modern monarchy. Foreign leaders walk past it. Prime ministers pass it on their way to formal engagements. It is not a corridor. It is a statement. Diana's portrait was supposed to be on it. People who were present when Diana first saw the finished work have described a very specific kind of silence that came over her as she stood in front of it. Not the silence of disappointment, not the silence of someone who wants to be polite about something they don't like. The silence of someone who has seen something that has captured a truth about them they hadn't expected anyone to see. That kind of silence is rarer than most people realize. She died before it ever went up, and in the months that followed her death in August of 1997, while the flowers piled up outside palace gates and the world grieved in a way that had genuinely never happened before for a royal figure, that portrait was quietly removed from consideration and placed in storage, where it stayed for 25 years. Now, ask yourself a question. Why would the most beloved royal figure of her generation, a woman whose funeral was watched by 2.5 billion people worldwide, have her portrait removed from a wall of honor and kept in a storage room for over 2 decades? Not loaned to a museum, not placed elsewhere in the residence, stored in the dark, like something that made someone uncomfortable. That question is the center of this entire story. What was happening behind the gates? The public grief in September 1997 was enormous, and it was real. But what was happening inside those palace walls in the hours and days after Diana's death was a very different story to the one playing out on television. Royal insiders have reported for years that some of the earliest concerns raised inside the palace in the hours immediately following confirmation of her death centered not on her children, not on the public response, but on the whereabouts of crown jewelry that had been in her possession. Before the British public had even been formally informed that their princess was gone, somebody inside those walls wanted an inventory. That detail matters because of what it tells you about the temperature inside the institution at that moment. And then there was Camilla. Camilla Parker Bowles had spent years as the woman in the background, the relationship Charles maintained in secret throughout his marriage to Diana. Diana had a name for her. She called her the Rottweiler. Not because she was unintelligent, because Diana was sharp enough to understand exactly what Camilla was doing and exactly how effective she was at it. The marriage had 3 people in it. Diana said so, publicly. The whole country heard it. Now Diana was gone. and Camilla began moving through the spaces Diana had called home. But here is the thing, and this distinction matters more than it might first appear. Moving into someone's space is one thing. What Camilla did was different. She didn't simply occupy those rooms. She worked to eliminate what was in them. Diana had kept fresh flowers throughout the royal residences she lived in, arrangements she had chosen personally, because that kind of small, intentional detail was part of how she made a space feel like hers. Camilla had them removed, not replaced, removed and burned. There is a meaningful difference between throwing something away and destroying it, and the staff in that building knew exactly which instruction they were being given. Diana's bedroom, the room where she had held her sons, where she had written privately, where she had spent long sleepless nights with no one to talk to, was ordered locked, not redecorated, not repurposed, locked permanently. Camilla had no interest in using the room herself. She simply made sure nobody else could ever use it either. Think about that choice for a moment, because it says everything. Diana's personal belongings were relocated. Her image began quietly disappearing from the most prominent ceremonial spaces across the royal residences. And this is the part that speaks to how well this was managed as a process. It didn't happen all at once. There was never a memo, never an announcement. One frame moved to a smaller room, another shifted to a side corridor, a third simply stopped being anywhere anyone could find it. By the time you noticed the pattern, there was nothing left to point at, and the Hall of Matriarchs stayed empty where Diana's face should have been. The boy who walked behind the coffin. William was 15 years old on the 6th of September, 1997. He walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London, in front of the entire world, with his face arranged into an expression that revealed absolutely nothing. What people sometimes forget when they recall that image is that he was not walking as an innocent child who didn't yet understand what had happened. He already knew. Diana had sat him down and explained that his father had been involved with another woman throughout their marriage. She told him there were 3 people in that marriage, and that it was the reason the family had come apart. He walked that route, already knowing the shape of the wound. Harry found out differently. He was watching a television program about the monarchy with his mother when Camilla's name appeared on screen. He turned to Diana and asked who she was. Diana had to explain it to her younger son, Liv, in the middle of a program, with no preparation and no gentler version of the truth available to offer him. But the thing that would harden something permanently inside William didn't come from a conversation. It came from a letter.
2 years before Diana died, she wrote a note to her solicitor, Lord Mishkan. In that note, she stated her belief that her husband was planning to arrange her death in a staged car accident. She described it in specific terms: brake failure, a serious head injury, a scenario that would leave him free to move forward with his life. She named Camilla. She described herself as a woman being used in every sense of the word by the man
she had married. 2 years later, Diana died in a car crash in a tunnel in Paris. The note was handed to police after her death and then sat untouched for 6 years before it reached Scotland Yard. 6 years. I want to be completely straight with you about what the official inquiry ultimately concluded. It found no evidence of a conspiracy. I'm not here to tell you Diana was right about what she feared. I am telling you that she was frightened enough of the man she had married to put it in writing, hand it to her legal representative, and that 6 years passed before the police examined it. And I'm telling you that her son eventually read it. Watch every decision William has made since he read that letter, because it is the context for all of them. He watched Camilla move into his mother's spaces. He watched portraits removed. He watched the Hall of Matriarchs stand empty at every family occasion, every state event, every Christmas and wedding and ceremonial gathering for 25 years. He walked past that wall and counted the faces. He knew exactly whose was missing and exactly why. And in public, he kept his face completely still, the way he had learned to at 15. At 16, he reportedly broke once, pulled someone he trusted aside, and let everything out. He said Camilla had gotten her grip on his father and never released it. He said that was the reason his mother was dead, because Diana had been stripped of protection, isolated, and driven so far outside her own family that she ended up alone and unguarded in Paris in the middle of the night. Those words, spoken at 16, never left him. He simply chose not to repeat them to anyone who could use them against him. That is the detail about William that people consistently underestimate. He learned at 15 that saying a true thing at the wrong moment gets you nothing except the temporary satisfaction of having said it. So he waited and waited for 25 years while building a knee, the other wound. But William wasn't the only person in that family carrying a wound directly connected to Camilla. There was one other, and her wound was older than his and ran deeper and started well before Diana ever entered the picture. Princess Anne. Before Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles, Andrew Parker Bowles was in a serious relationship with Anne herself. This was not rumor or retrospective gossip. They were close. Marriage had been discussed between them, and the institution stepped in and ended it. Andrew was Catholic. As a senior member of the Church of England, Anne was not permitted to marry him. She was told no by the same institution she has given her entire adult life to. So she stepped aside, because that is what Anne has always done when the family requires it. Within a short time, Camilla was with Andrew, and Anne sat in the pews at their wedding in 1973 and watched it happen. Hold that image for a moment. A young woman in her early 20s, sitting in a church, watching the man the institution had told her she wasn't allowed to marry the woman who came in after, with photographers outside, with her face arranged into exactly the expression the occasion required of her. And she never said a public word about it. Not then, not since, not one syllable. That is the foundational fact about Anne that everything else has to be read against. She is not a woman who erupts. She is not a woman who creates public drama or leaks grievances to sympathetic journalists. She files things away, for decades, if necessary. And then the woman who took Andrew Parker Bowles spent the years that followed as the hidden partner who helped destroy Anne's brother's marriage, tore Diana into pieces in front of the entire world, and eventually arrived at Buckingham Palace with a crown on her head. Royal biographers have written for years that Camilla was genuinely intimidated by Anne, that the coldness Anne directed toward her was unlike anything else she encountered inside that family. And I want to be precise about what that coldness actually looks like in practice, because it is not anything a camera can catch. It is being spoken to correctly at every dinner for 50 years without being spoken to like family at a single one of them. It is the specific, sustained chill of a woman who is never quite rude enough to give you something to complain about. After the coronation in May of 2023, Anne reportedly looked Camilla directly in the eye at a private luncheon and said something that has circulated inside household staff ever since. She told her that she is not the queen, that she is the king's wife. Anne has allegedly never bowed to Camilla, not once. The story goes that she requested exemption from that protocol directly from Queen Elizabeth, and that the Queen granted it without much debate. And through all of it, Anne watched Diana disappear from the walls. She watched the portrait go into storage. She watched the Hall of Matriarchs stand incomplete for 20 years. She watched the most beloved member of the modern monarchy get quietly erased from her own family's ceremonial spaces. And she carried every piece of it in the way that Anne carries everything, in total silence, without ever giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing it. The phone call. 2 people, 2 separate wounds, 2 decades of waiting, and eventually 1 phone call. William had been building toward this moment for years, and the preparation tells you everything about the kind of future king he is going to be. He didn't walk into a gallery with a painting under his arm on an impulse. He took formal meetings with curators about portrait placement protocol. He went through decades of historical records on every previous placement on that wall, so that every step had verifiable precedent behind it. He made absolutely certain that when Diana's portrait went up, there was no administrative mechanism, no institutional procedure, no legal angle, no appeal process that could be used to bring it back down. He had been playing a very long game inside his own family. This was the move the entire game had been working toward. The night before it happened, William rang Anne. The call was brief. Neither of them needed a lengthy one. Both had been waiting long enough that the words, when they finally came, didn't need to be many. Anne said she couldn't wait to see the reaction. She said it was long overdue. She said Diana deserved to come home. William said She comes home tomorrow. That was the entire call. Two people in separate buildings. Between them, a combined 70 years of saying nothing in the rooms that mattered, agreeing in 30 seconds to do the one thing nobody inside that household had ever dared attempt. Camilla had no idea. She had spent 25 years believing the argument was settled in her favor. She had the title, the ring, the crown placed on her head at Westminster Abbey, the walls arranged exactly as she wanted them. She was about to discover how wrong she had been about every single bit of it. The planning around the execution of this moment is genuinely worth examining closely, because it removes any possibility that what happened was spontaneous or sentimental. Camilla had been placed on an engagement outside London that day. Her presence in that diary slot was not coincidence, and it was not luck. Someone sat with a schedule and made sure she would be out of the building, in another city, with no practical way to intervene, until everything was finished and impossible to reverse. The Hall of Matriarchs was closed. Not to everyone. A small group of personally vetted staff were permitted inside, people who had been selected because they understood what they were about to be part of and could be trusted with the silence it required. Nothing appeared on the official royal diary. No press communication was prepared, drafted, or held ready for release. There was no plan whatsoever to tell anyone. That is how you know this was never about making a public statement. This was about getting it done. In the early evening, Diana's portrait was carried into the Hall of Matriarchs. It had been in protective wrapping in a storage room for more than 2 decades. People who were present that evening have described the way the staff moved with it. Slowly, carefully, with the specific gentleness people extend to something that has already been damaged once and doesn't deserve to be damaged again. Princess Anne was in the room, not because William's plan required her to be. The curators had the technical knowledge. The protocol had been cleared. Every precedent had been checked and rechecked across months of preparation. She could have stayed home and read about it in the morning. She chose to be there because after 50 years, she was going to watch this happen with her own eyes. No proxy, no report, no intermediary, her. The protective wrapping came off. For the first time in more than 2 decades, Diana's portrait was fully visible inside Windsor Castle, in the room where it had always been intended to go. Anne had known that face when it was young. She was in the family before Diana arrived. She watched the entire arc of Diana's life inside the institution, the wedding, the collapse of the marriage, the public grief, the funeral. She had watched it from a few feet away for almost 2 decades. So when that wrapping came off, she was not looking at an icon. She was not looking at a magazine cover or a museum piece. She was looking at a girl she had watched be destroyed by the same institution both of them had given everything to. The frame was measured, confirmed, measured again. On a wall of that significance, precision is not optional. And within 90 minutes of the portrait arriving in that gallery, Diana's face was on the wall, placed directly beside Queen Elizabeth. 2 women side by side, one who reigned for 70 years, one who was never permitted to reign at all, right where the pair of them should have stood from the very beginning. The room went quiet. Multiple accounts from people who were present described the same thing. Nobody spoke, nobody made a toast or a speech or said something commemorative. They stood in a closed gallery in a still castle and looked at a portrait that should never have been removed in the first place. And then Princess Anne, almost to herself, in the way someone speaks when a sentence has been sitting in their chest long enough that it comes out before they have quite decided to say it, said, "Diana belongs here. She always did. Not she deserved to be here. Not it's about time. Belongs." Present tense. As though the last 25 years had been an administrative error someone had finally corrected. From a woman who has spent 7 decades not saying the things she thinks in rooms full of people who would have used them against her. Staff nearby heard it clearly enough to remember it exactly. The morning everything changed. Camilla returned from her engagement that evening and slept at the palace with no idea what was hanging on the wall at Windsor. The next morning, she found out. The reaction was immediate and physical. She went rigid with fury in a corridor in front of staff who suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere. She demanded the portrait be taken down at once. She demanded an emergency meeting with William. She demanded Charles personally intervene. She demanded the names of every staff member who had been inside that gallery. Every demand was refused. Notice that last one. It's the most revealing. She wanted names. That's not the instinct of someone who wants a painting moved. That's the instinct of someone who intends to deal with the people responsible, the way she has historically dealt with people who didn't follow her preferences. They wouldn't give her the names either. For the first time in her royal life, Camilla was powerless inside a building she'd spent 25 years quietly restructuring around herself. She had come to believe, reasonably, based on years of evidence, that in that building, what Camilla found uncomfortable became what Camilla never had to see again. Rooms locked because she wanted them locked. Flowers burned because she wanted them gone. Portraits removed without a single written instruction. She'd shaped the environment without anyone ever recording that she'd done it. Now that building had been restructured around someone else, and she had no leverage to stop it. But the refused demands weren't the worst moment of that morning. The worst moment was Charles. He had spent decades going to war for this woman, fought the institution when it resisted her, faced down public contempt for years, absorbed the anger of both sons, who'd told him directly not to marry her. He had always been the one person who stood between her and the consequences of her choices. She stood in front of him and waited for him to make a phone call. He said nothing, didn't reach for the phone, didn't challenge the decision, didn't send a word to his private secretary. He let the portrait stand. He let his son's work stay intact. He let his sister go unchallenged. And with his silence, he handed his wife the entire cost of the morning. A phone call would have cost him almost nothing. He is the sovereign. One sentence in the right direction, and that painting comes down by lunchtime. He chose not to. Palace insiders have suggested that in that silence, Camilla finally understood something she'd never been forced to look at, that Charles had made a choice, chosen his son, chosen the institution's debt to Diana, chosen to honor the woman he'd spent 30 years wronging. And the price of that choice was handed to the person standing in front of him. 5 words. And then Princess Anne walked into the room. Nothing in William's plan included this. His entire operation had been built for silence, a legally airtight repositioning that would never need defending out loud. The plan was finished the moment the frame went up. It was designed to speak for itself, Anne walking in to say it too. Camilla's face wasn't something William knew was coming. He found out the same way everyone else did afterwards. She arrived alone. No aides, no witnesses. She looked at the woman who had ordered Diana's flowers burned, who had locked Diana's bedroom so no one could ever use it again, who had watched Diana's portrait vanish from these walls for 20 years and never once asked where it went. And she said 5 words. It is what Diana deserved. Past tense. A debt. Outstanding for 25 years. Stated plainly as a debt now settled. 5 words. From a woman who has spent 70 years perfecting the discipline of not saying what she thinks, to the one person she has never been afraid of. Not once. Not even after the crown went on. And then she walked back out. Camilla stood there and took it. There was no comeback available. No authority to invoke, no version of the next sentence where she came out with any ground recovered. The story got out of course. 5 words in an empty room at Windsor Castle are worth more to a newspaper than any press release. And when it landed everywhere. The restructuring that followed. What came after wasn't just a bad week for Camilla. It was the visible start of a permanent shift. She was quietly dropped from a series of upcoming engagements. No announcement, just gone from the schedule. The way things go when someone upstairs has decided and doesn't feel the need to explain. Royal patronages Diana had founded, hospice care, AIDS wards where she shook patients' hands without gloves, when that gesture alone made headlines. Landmine clearance in active conflict zones began quietly reappearing under Catherine and William's diary. Here's the number that says more than any commentary. The royal family's official communications mentioned Diana's name more in the 2 weeks after the portrait went up than in the previous 2 years combined. That's not sentiment, that's signaling, and it doesn't reverse. Everyone on the payroll understood the shift at the same time. What William actually is. You can't understand any of this without being honest about what kind of man William turned out to be. Not the one from the receiving line, the one underneath. He was 16 when he formed a settled view of what Camilla had done to his mother. That view hasn't moved in 30 years. He's simply been far more disciplined than his brother about concealing it. Harry's version is documented publicly. In January 2023, he wrote that he and William both pleaded with Charles not to marry Camilla. He said it all, publicly, and absorbed the consequences. William chose a different weapon, the institution itself. Patience, learning the rules well enough that no one could use them against him, then moving once, cleanly, at a moment entirely of his own choosing, legally irreversible before anyone knew it was happening. That's why Charles has reportedly asked his son privately not to push Camilla aside after his death, because Charles knows what William is. The moment he takes the throne, every element of Camilla's position gets reviewed by a man who has never forgotten and has now proven he's willing to act. Diana on the wall. Diana's portrait hangs now in the Hall of Matriarchs at Windsor, beside Queen Elizabeth, two women who defined the emotional shape of the modern monarchy, standing together where they should have stood for a quarter century. William was 15 when he walked behind his mother's coffin through London. He made himself a promise on that route. Then he did the hardest thing a furious person can do, nothing, for 25 years, while building something underneath so solid no one could shift it. And when he was ready, he brought in the one person with the history and the nerve to make it permanent. Quietly, on one evening, while Camilla slept across London with no idea, they walked Diana home. Now Camilla walks past that wall every day, in a house she spent 25 years reshaping, past a portrait she cannot touch, with 5 words from her sister-in-law following her down every corridor for as long as she remains in it. A debt settled, a wall completed, a promise made by a 15-year-old boy on the most watched road in British history, finally kept. If you think William is finished, you have not been paying attention. Make sure you are subscribed, because where this goes next is a story you do not want to walk into halfway.